Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to hear from an amazing lineup of speakers all about the Fossil-Free Finance Act and how everyone on this call can support the bill. My name is Karina Williams. I'm a campaigner with Public Citizen, and I'm really excited to be joined by leaders and experts from Public Citizen, Americans for Financial Reform, Stop the Money Pipeline, Positive Money, Sunrise Project, and Mazaska Talks, who have all played a huge part in making tonight happen. Throughout the webinar, you're welcome to submit questions in the chat or through the Q&A tab at the bottom, and we will have space at the end to answer questions. And so to begin, we just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the land and labor of Indigenous peoples and Black communities. I'm calling in from Tonga land and Gabrielino land. Please, again, feel free to take a moment to share your name, the land you're calling in from, and why you've joined in the chat. You can also learn whose land you're living on at native-land.ca, and there will also be a link to that website shared in the chat. I just think it's really important that we acknowledge that we live and work in the ancestral lands of Indigenous nations that have existed since before the creation of the United States. And we also want to recognize that the United States as we know it was built off of the backs of forcefully enslaved Black people. Please take a moment to consider the legacies and generations of violence, displacement, and settlement that have brought us here today, and really just acknowledge that the work to dismantle historical systems of oppression is both an individual and a collective effort and is always ongoing. Again, you can learn whose land you're on at native-land.ca, and just loving everyone showing where they're from and saying how excited they are to be here. And I see, yeah, the links dropped in. Feel free to go onto those links and just look around and be able to see whose land you're on. And so tonight we're going to hear from Tracey Lewis, Grace Regullano, and Matt Remle. I'm going to start just giving some speaker introductions before I pass it off to the experts. So first, Tracey Lewis uses she, her pronouns. She is policy counsel in the climate program at Public Citizen. Tracey advocates for financial regulators to direct companies, banks, money managers, and other private actors to better identify and address the risk related to the climate crisis. Tracey has broad experience advising organizations on equity and environmental law and policy. Our next speaker will be Grace Regullano, also uses she, her pronouns. She is the Private Banks Program Director for the Sunrise Project, and Grace has spent nearly 20 years in the American labor movement as an organizer, communication specialist, and researcher. And finally, we have Matt Remle, he, him pronouns. Matt is the editor of the Native News page, Last Real Indians. He is a member of Seattle's Green New Deal Oversight Board and a member of Stop the Money Pipeline Steering Committee. Matt has authored and collaborated on many pieces of legislation in Seattle, as well as the National Congress of American Indians resolution calling on insurance companies to adopt policies for free, prior, and informed consent. So it's a pretty incredible lineup of folks tonight, and I'm really excited to hear them share their wisdom. And first, I'm going to pass it over to Tracey to give us some background on the Fossil-Free Finance Act.
Okay, I just want to make sure, can you all hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, thanks. So I have my screen diminished so I can read my remarks. Well, one, thank you all so much for coming. It's really wonderful to see folks from, I saw Belfast, Maine to San Francisco. So I really appreciate you all being here. And I'm Tracey, and I'm calling from Piscataway land here in Maryland. And thank you all for sharing where you're calling from as well. So I just want to give you a little background on the Fossil-Free Finance Act. In its most simple terms, it's really meant to address the funding of the fossil fuel industry through our financial system. And we want to see that stop. But stretching out a little bit more, because this would be a very short conversation, the FFFA is legislation that requires the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed, to use its current regulatory authorities to address the threats that climate change and the clean energy transition pose to large institutions that the Fed supervises. And what these threats look like, it's not just esoteric kind of out of the air, but there are two types of threats. One is physical, the second is transition risks. And physical risks are the kind of tangible effects that climate has on organizations and cities, towns, like flooding, extreme weather, or drought, for example. And what transition risks look like, those are risks that are related to the transition away from reliance on fossil fuels and toward a low carbon economy. So that is just, for example, as we move away from, say, oil and gas, what happens to those oil wells as we start reducing our use? They need to be plugged and made safe as much as possible. So you all may recall that back in March, the United States saw 3 successive bank failures: Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic Bank. And in a really interesting fact, the total assets of those 3 banks exceed the assets held by 25 banks that collapsed during the 2008 crisis, which is pretty stunning. Because of those 3 banks, they're not considered large financial institutions like Bank of America or Wells Fargo. So despite those clear warning signs that collapse was ahead, the Fed actually took very little to no action to rein in those obvious excesses and of the financial risks posed by particularly Silicon Valley Bank. And as the Federal Reserve Vice Chair of Supervision, Michael Barr, noted in his report on SVB's failure, the Fed had not even contemplated that a regional bank failure would pose a systemic threat to the safety and soundness of the entire financial system. Now, I just want to pause there for a moment, knowing that anybody who was alive today and was an adult in 2008 knows how there are, it's the job of the Fed to monitor our financial system and to seek out and stop whatever risks that pose that threat. And they simply had not even considered that smaller banks can pose that type of risk, sleeping at the wheel. So, as I said, those risks were clear and the regulators were fully apprised, but woefully slow to act. And those same arguments about risk can be made for climate-related financial risks. And that's why we need Senator Markey, Representative Presley's Fossil-Free Finance Act right now. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen actually said days before the SVB collapse that taking climate change into account is prudent risk management. This also follows the Financial Stability Oversight Council's 2021 recognition that climate-related financial risks have the potential to affect the safety and soundness of banks through physical and transition risks, which I noted earlier. And those physical and transition risks affect various sectors of the economy and may affect access to financial services and fair treatment of customers. And then let's just add this on to what the White House also said in its initial 2021 climate executive order, that it's the policy of the administration to organize and deploy the full capacity of its agencies to combat the climate crisis and implement a government-wide approach that reduces climate pollution in every sector of the economy, increases resilience to the impacts of climate change, among others. So having all that information, right, from the White House to Treasury, OCC, it's very clear the direction that our policymaking is moving, is to ensure that we are mitigating climate financial risks that are posed to our financial system, and that is the number one goal. And so how the FFFA addresses this is by ensuring that the Fed cannot continue to sit back and twiddle its thumbs. This bill will require the Fed to mitigate those climate financial risks by aligning the institutions it supervises with science-based climate targets. That's number one. And in so doing, it both protects individual financial institutions and the system by reducing harm from physical changes in the climate, reducing risk of instability due to overinvestment in high emissions assets. So what in regular human language, that just means that we see increasing investment in fossil fuel projects. The Mountain Valley Pipeline is a perfect example. And I won't I won't comment on what happened with the debt ceiling and all of that, but needless to say that there are parts of the Biden administration that are at odds with each other. But the duty of Congress is to ensure that there is a legislative framework to help address those concerns. So just going back to my little comment here. So by reducing the risk of instability due to overinvestment in those high emissions assets, that will definitely decline in value as we continue to decarbonize our economy and our financial system. The FFFA will help smooth those rough edges. So, and how it will do that is it will require that the largest banks with over 50 billion in assets and other systemically important non-bank financial institutions, so that would be like Quickens or Rocket Mortgage, that are not financial depository institutions, but they still hold billions of dollars in mortgages, for example. So those institutions that are supervised by the Fed will have to submit and follow plans for achieving zero financed emissions by 2050, in line with the trajectory set by the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other global climate targets. So wait, how am I doing on time?
You're good, keep going.
Okay, sorry, just with the reduced screen, I'm not seeing any faces. So the other way that this bill addresses emerging threats to financial stability is it also requires that these financial institutions are required now under this bill to deliver transition plans that include the following milestones: 50% reduction in financed emissions by 2030, 100% reduction in financed emissions by 2050, and then the discontinuing of financing for any new or expanded fossil fuel projects, thermal coal projects, and any other fossil fuel financing between 2025 and 2030. And the last requirement of the bill is the discontinuing of financing of deforestation risk commodities. So logging would be a perfect example of that. Another way this bill works is by mandating the Fed to require transition plans from these same financial institutions to account for the impacts on the communities that surround them and are affected and suffering from environmental racism. It will require the banks to also prioritize phasing out funding for fossil fuel projects that cause disproportionate harm to vulnerable communities, as well as provide financing for companies to help workers affected by the transition to a low carbon future. So if you can imagine folks who currently work in oil and gas on pipelines, those are very high paying union jobs more often than not. And the goal of this bill is not to put more people on unemployment, but to ensure that they have the proper training and education to move to more sustainable jobs that we hope will exist in a plentiful amount in the near future. And one of the last things about this bill is that it limits the use of false or unproven solutions like carbon offsets or carbon capture and sequestration technology that we know has not been proven to have any real effect on lessening carbon in our atmosphere. And they take advantage of tax breaks without providing any mitigation. So what's really important here is that as we continue to move towards a decarbonized future, that the Federal Reserve is not playing catch up and not watching our financial sorry, I just lost my place, but it's making sure that our financial institutions are not exposed to climate related threats. And so in order to be effective, the Fossil Free Finance Act makes sure that that's possible. And with that, I will close.
Thank you, Tracey. That was so helpful. Next, we are going to pass it to Grace to talk a bit about the banking crisis.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, my voice is making a recovery. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the banking crisis and what it means in terms of why we need litigation and regulation. So the ongoing banking crisis and failures of several banks that Tracey mentioned have put systemic risk and the role of financial regulation briefly front and center in the public mind. This means that the edges of the Overton window have been softened, but we now have to take advantage of those softened edges in order to actually push the window open. The risk, if we don't, is that the perverse incentives of yet another collapse and bailout without consequences will further incentivize increasingly risky practices such as fossil fuel investment. We have an opportunity now to simultaneously pivot to climate regulation and legislation, while at the same time firming up the ground on bread and butter financial regulation to make that pivot on climate even stronger. So there are clear parallels between what happened with the failed banks, especially Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse, and climate risk. As the industry gets closer to an inevitable cliff, the mispriced climate risk creates defaults or deposit withdrawals at several banks at once, triggering similar systemic shocks that we have seen so far this year. As we've seen with both this round of failures and previous bank crises, bank CEOs will always try to have their cake and eat it too. They will claim that they could never have anticipated these failures and that regulators fell down on the job by not expressing concerns about things like strategy or liquidity, while obfuscating the fact that these bank CEOs were spending company dollars on lobbyists to fight against the very regulation that would have mitigated the likelihood of the crisis. In terms of global regulation, it's also become clear that inferior US regulation has global consequences. On the one hand, European regulators smugly claiming there is no risk of contagion because they did not roll back protections the way that the US did. And on the other hand, Swiss authorities placing a heavy emphasis on the role of US regional banking collapses in pushing Credit Suisse to the brink. Meanwhile, in the US, we're seeing bank regulators make half-hearted attempts to be seen to be doing something, such as by proposing capital requirements increases. But even as they make the required noises while under the microscope of public scrutiny, they are passing up opportunities to regulate that are already within their grasp. You can go to the next slide. For example, so this is a slide that shows how basically the regulators and the bank CEOs are just two sides of the same coin. For example, Treasury Secretary Yellen told CEOs of large banks that more bank mergers may be necessary to navigate through this crisis. A ludicrous conclusion on its face and an example of the short-termism of US regulators. Banks are failing because they're underregulated. And instead of stepping up on regulation, the government is going to allow further corporate concentration at the expense of the customers and taxpayers who will once again pay the price for the increased abuse of power of too big to fail banks. And you'll see here that while the left is, doing its best to mobilize, progressives and the left are doing its best to mobilize, corporate power takes every opportunity to push back against regulation. In the immediate aftermath of one of the bank failures, Jamie Dimon cautioned against avoiding knee-jerk, whack-a-mole, or politically motivated responses, and opined further that disruptions in the market were in fact caused by regulations that damage the safety of the whole system. So you can see that corporations and the right are extremely disciplined about their message. When there's no crisis, but they don't need regulation. When there is a crisis, they don't need regulation. It's extremely disciplined message on their part. So all this is happening while bank regulators are ominously silent on the opportunity to regulate that is within their grasp. I've already mentioned bank mergers, which, as you've seen, Janet Yellen is already ceding ground on. There's another opportunity to regulate in front of bank regulators on syndicated loans, which is a type of loan arranged by a group of banks and is a significant source of financing for fossil fuel companies and other highly risky industries. The fact is, bank regulators are so in the pocket of Wall Street banks that the attorney for JP Morgan Chase asked the judge in the Second Circuit in the lawsuit about these loans to solicit the opinions of bank regulators, which the attorney would not have done unless they knew full well that bank regulators would be against regulating properly. This is why legislation is so important. Big banks must be required to take climate risk seriously. US bank regulators are slow, they're timid, and they're too often part of a revolving door of influence with the very banks that they are supposed to be regulating. Once again, they're just the opposite side to the same coin as the banks and CEOs that they're regulating. We all know that climate risk is financial risk. Many of us, in fact, right this very minute, are dealing with terrible air quality conditions due to the climate fires happening in Canada. And we also know that financial risk hits hardest for everyday workers and families, especially low income and minority communities. The banks know this. They have entire divisions devoted to risk management. The point is, they don't have to care because, as bailout after bailout has shown, they can privatize profits and socialize losses with the blessing of the regulators that are supposed to protect our financial system. So really glad folks are here today to learn about one of the tools that are available to us in order to mitigate some of this risk. And I'll pass it back to you, Karina.
Thank you so much, Grace. Next, we will hear from Matt to talk about some Indigenous impacts.
Mataki epi chante washtea nape e chusam la ko ya wakiam wanata na machiam ina Donna Harrison echiam ate Charles Remle echiam onchi Dorothy Nadine White and Dorothy Remle wichakiam la Colonel Harrison and Herbert Remle wichakiam Lakota Hunkpapa Lakota wimachasha na ya waslaha emataha e ashwana siero ewati na stohopsh makoche ki owana waun tukashila lena wichasha muya lila wopila tanka tukashila onchi maka okia chin. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My English name is Matt Remle. My Lakota name is Wakia Wanatan. I am Hunkpapa Lakota from Standing Rock, but I live in Seattle and currently on the lands of the Stohopsh or Tulalip's peoples, where I'm calling in from today. I was just introducing myself to you all in my traditional language, Lakota language, letting you know who my family is, where I come from, and thanking the previous panelists, the coordinators and organizers of this event, and also asking that, our Unchimaka, our grandmother Earth, she's in a time of great need. And so it is good that we all come together here today to look at one of the tools we can utilize in addressing not only the climate crisis, but the impacts that occur on Indigenous lands globally, communities of color, low-income communities, through environmental justice, environmental racism, the negative impacts to our health, the violation of treaty rights, and so on and so forth. So I'm very happy to be here today. I apologize for a little bit. Actually, I don't apologize for a little bit of a long introduction, but that traditionally be even much longer. It's important to let people know who you are and where you come from. So I'm the co-founder of Musaska Talks. I also sit on the steering committee of Stop the Money Pipeline, and currently am one of the sit on the Seattle's Green New Deal oversight board. Musaska Talks, we came out of the fight in my homelands in Yanwaslaha in Standing Rock, with the Dakota Access Pipeline going through our territories, and the strategy that some of us, especially in the Northwest, drove towards to put a spotlight on the financial institutions, in particular the banks, as well as the insurance companies, because none of these projects can happen without accessing capital, accessing loans, not from just one bank, but multiple banks, as well as insurance from multiple insurance companies. And so we kind of wanted to punish them. We realized the Energy Transfer Partners in no way was going to bend to, they're out for profit, and they could really care less about the impacts to, one, breaking their own laws. That company was in violation of treaty rights and in violation of human rights, and destroying sacred sites, destroying cultural artifacts, and so on and so forth. So can really care less about that, and because they're driven by one thing, and that's just the profit motive, profit above planet, profit above life, including. So we decided to really zero in on those who were financing or giving out loans to Dakota Access Pipeline, and we wanted to punish them, to put a spotlight on them, because for too long they've kind of been in the background, not only financing and making these projects feasible, but profiting off of them as well, profiting off the suffering of our planet and suffering of our communities. And so we really are a big believer in what we call kind of like a toolkit. We got multiple tools in the toolbox to use to protect our homelands, to protect our families, to protect our other non-human relatives, and going after the financial sector is one of them. And I'm a big supporter of this act, in the sense that anything to protect our future generations is an important and necessary step. It's not the one all be all, and no thing really ever is. It's just one tool to utilize while we seek to protect future generations. One of the things in particular that I also wanted to emphasize was in the introduction earlier, I mentioned there was mention of my work with the National Congress of American Indians and pressing for financial institutions to adopt free, prior, and informed consent policies. For those who are excuse me, for those who are unfamiliar, free, prior, informed consent, or FPIC, comes out of the UN's Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that came after multiple decades of Indigenous peoples from around the world who came together and actually originally convened in Standing Rock back in the 1970s, a multi-decade effort to push for the rights of Indigenous peoples at the global level. And one of the cornerstones or bedrocks of Universal Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples is what's called free, prior, informed consent, or FPIC, which is really a pretty simple, basic concept. And that's that folks from governments, businesses, various institutions, if they're to engage on any tribal lands, indigenous lands, that there be a process of true informed consultation, meaningful consultation, and obtaining consent. And if consent does not occur, then the projects don't happen. And we were able to get the National Congress of American Indians, who's a representative body of some 500 plus federally recognized tribes who are pushing for this, past this, and asking the banks and insurance companies to do the same, to not give any loans or any underwriting of insurance if these companies have not attained FPIC. It's one thing that I would encourage the sponsors of the fossil fuel free act to incorporate an FPIC policy, because the climate crisis is often talked of and has been talked in kind of a future tense, something that is gonna happen, something that we're gonna see in communities over the past couple of years outside of indigenous communities in other places around the world. They are now starting to experience what we have been experiencing for decades, and what our communities have been calling out for decades. And so having the indigenous voice, the indigenous concerns is centrally important, because I'll be honest, there's a rush, and it's needed rush to address the climate crisis, but oftentimes what can happen by even very well-meaning people is an oversight of the potential impacts that the pushing of other priorities can have on our communities. And so, and that includes what we might call green projects, green infrastructure, if not done properly, can have just as negative impacts or consequences on indigenous communities, indigenous homelands. And we're seeing this now in the Southwest, with tribes in the Southwest and Native peoples down in South America, where there's not been a process of consultation and consent, where a lot of lithium mining has taken place. Of course, we want to transition off of fossil fuels, but the reality is where that mining is taking place could have an extremely negative impact on cultural sites, sacred sites, and in the pollution, the waste that's left behind. When I say things like sacred sites, it's really just kind of our way of saying where we go to engage in ceremony, where we go to engage in prayer. And just like someone who might go to a church or synagogue, a temple or a mosque, the only difference being is where we go it's not four walls and a ceiling. It's out in our kind of natural world, and they can't be replaced. If you destroy a sacred site, that's it. That's the only one of its kind in existence. It can't be rebuilt somewhere else. And as indigenous peoples, and we kick this whole thing off with land acknowledgements, and that's good, but there also needs to be really respecting the traditional knowledge and the expertise of Indigenous communities globally as well. And so when we talk about these sacred sites, what comes with that is an understanding that we as Indigenous communities, and again, this is a global teaching. It don't matter if you're out in Lakota territory, Coast Salish territory, Aboriginal territory. I've heard similar teachings from tribal peoples from around the globe. With sacred sites comes an understanding of a role and responsibility that is to be engaged by the Indigenous communities of that area. That is our responsibility towards not only ensuring the continued life of our communities, our families, our tribal nations, but that of all creation. It's our role within there. It's our responsibility to engage and conduct certain ceremonies at certain locations at certain times of the year. And this, again, is a shared understanding globally. But the destruction of these sacred sites, whether it's for well-meaning green projects or not, means that these certain ceremonies cannot be engaged upon. And that means that unbalance occurs, you know. And I often explain this to folks, this idea or understanding of shared responsibility when we talk about things like our plant and animal relatives, that each and every single day they're engaged in a process of fulfilling their responsibility towards life, continuing, and they do it unconsciously. They just do it as their everyday actions, their everyday going about. So you think about the pollinators, they don't sit and think, should I pollinate today? They just go out, the bees and stuff, they just go out and pollinate. The trees right now, as we're having this webinar, they're filtering that carbon and releasing oxygen, not just for it to live, but for all creation to live. And we understand through, in Lakota, we say, mitakawe oyasin, which means we're all related, we're all connected. So we understand that our relatives, our non-human relatives, have a shared responsibility, then we do too. So I just wanted to bring on, I know it strays a little bit from the idea, what we're talking about here on policy, but these are some of the teachings and understandings that go by that you know, drive us for doing the things we do, like in Standing Rock on Line 3, Line 5, and these Trans Mountain Pipeline, all these fossil fuel projects where people are literally putting their selves on the lives on the line. But this is why. These are some of the reasons why. So last thing I'll leave you with is I'm also a very big believer. I apologize, I probably went way over my time, but I'm a very big believer in taking things to the local level. So while this is being pushed for on the federal level, and let's hope you contact your representatives and senators to support this act, there's nothing stopping you from taking this to your city, your state, your county government, your tribal government, and push something similar on that local level. You know, if let them know that you don't want your city, your tribe, your county, your state to be banking with any of these financial institutions who are not already, or who are not agreeing to the goals of what's laid out here in this act. So I'll leave with that. I thank you for the time, and hope everybody has a good day.
Thank you, Matt, and no need to apologize all the time. We have important things to say. And so next we're going to get into how can everyone on this call support the Fossil Free Finance Act and getting it passed. At the moment, there are two main asks that we have of folks. First one would be to contact your representatives and your senators. The Fossil Free Finance Act could really have a huge impact on our fight against the climate crisis. And it'd be really helpful. And we're asking everyone on this call to take action and join us in fighting for this bill. Again, one way that you can help is by calling your senators and representatives and telling them why the Fossil Free Finance Act is important and urging them to support the bill. There will be a link in the chat that Aki just dropped, thank you, where you can get connected to, it'll take you to an action page, which will then help you identify your congressional members. And there's also a little script in there on how you can, advocate for this act, but feel free to go off script, say what it means to you, add in any part of, your own story and what this would mean for your community. And then another way is that we are planning a virtual lobbying day, August 7th through 11th. And so this is an additional opportunity to connect with your representatives and senators face-to-face or virtual face-to-face and get them to champion the Fossil Free Finance Act. If you or your organization are interested, you can reach out to me at kwilliams@citizen.org, and I'll follow up with resources for those meetings. I did see an earlier question on if orgs can sign on. At the moment, we are not taking any additional sign-ons. When the act was introduced, we did have 50 plus organizations, but if your organization is really energized around this, this is a great opportunity for you to plug in and show up at this virtual lobbying day. And in our remaining time, we will move to Q&A and see quite a few. So I think I'll pass the first question to Tracey, but any of the speakers feel free to jump in. But there was a question on the proposed SEC rule to require climate disclosures in corporate financial reports.
Yes, thanks so much. That's a great question. We're actually awaiting the for the rule to be finalized by the SEC. Just a little quick background. In 2021, the SEC put out a request for information to civil society and to investors and regular folks. And then they then did a first round draft of the rule and opened the comment period last March of 22. That it closed in mid-June of 22. And yes, wow, it's been about a year. We were anticipating that would come out this spring, but because now the Republicans are in charge of the House, they spent the first quarter of this year issuing a series of CRAs. So that's Congressional Review Act, where Congress has a certain period to try and basically knock down regulations. And I think that the SEC might have been sensitive to that, and it is just kind of holding it close. But I know Public Citizen, AFR, Stop the Money Pipeline, Positive Money, so many other orgs, we have all been fighting basically hand-to-hand combat on this to ensure that the rule is finalized. So, but happy to keep you abreast and follow our websites.
Thank you, Tracey. We have another question which might be for Grace, but again, anyone with knowledge, please jump in. There was a question if someone could explain the role of economic shocks and how this impacts banking crisis and then our work.
Sorry, just a clarification question. Do you mean by what's meant by economic shocks? Like, are you talking about like shock doctrine, capitalism, or unexpected events that have like a large impact? Just a little bit of clarification.
Yeah, I think it's referring to events, the last part.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the short answer is that the corporate class is very disciplined, as I said. When there's not a crisis, they're on message. When there is a crisis, they're on message. And I think that economic shocks create, like the Ukraine war, for example, which implies a level of privilege, right? To just even call these like terrible events economic shocks when they have like real life impacts that disproportionately impact women, children, and marginalized communities. There's these present opportunities to definitely increase profits and to push an agenda, because typically what happens is organizations, progressive organizations, have a focus on amelioration of the immediate crisis, while the opposition can focus on taking advantage of the crisis. So that's a short answer. I don't know if that gets to the question.
Thank you. And there was also an additional question. Tracey, I think you teased a little something about the debt ceiling. There is a question if we could just speak a little bit more about that.
I am going to do my best here, and we're also going to keep it super short. The debt ceiling bill that's now law had basically a lot of poison pills in it. Republicans know that they simply don't have the numbers. They can't build a coalition to get their agenda through, so they manufactured a debt crisis in order to accomplish what they cannot do electorally. So that included finishing the Mountain Valley Pipeline, removing it from judicial review, weakening NEPA, which is national. It's a part of the EPA review of any type of project that has environmental impacts. Of course, this like student loan, ending the pause permanently. So that's a little bit about the debt ceiling. I hope that's about it. Yeah, about as good as I can get on that.
No worries. Thank you. And then, Matt, I know you touched a bit about state efforts and local efforts that folks can take. Someone just asked if you could expand on the types of pressure that people could give at the state and local level.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So you can do quite a few actually on the local level to push for some of these type of legislations to be passed. For one, you could go to your city council and work on a kind of a localized version of this that what's called the request for proposal process, something we're working on with the city of Seattle. Anytime they have a city has a contract it wants to put out for a bank or insurance company for its payroll or whatever, you know, they have to put out a request for proposal to which banks and insurance companies will submit, and then they get selected or not. So one thing that we are currently working on is changing that, making some amendments, I should say, to Seattle's request for proposal RFP process that spells out things like this, that we're going to prioritize banks or insurance companies who, for example, have a free prior informed consent policy. We're going to prioritize banks who are not investing in fossil fuels, because there are banks out there who are not putting money into fossil fuel or coal or stuff like that. So that is one way folks can engage it. And again, that could be with your city, that could be with the county, that could be even honestly, if you're, we did a project in collaboration with 350 Seattle, and shout out to Alec, I saw him on here earlier. But anyways, we took this kind of same idea and put it out to NGOs and nonprofits and stuff like that, because a lot of folks got some big money, and you know, we encourage them to shift their money into other accounts. So, and again, all going back to that basic idea or concept that, you know, it's all these financial institutions care about. So losing out on lucrative contracts from cities or even larger NGOs is going to say a lot, you know, and going to impact them. So anyways, that's one example. You can do the same thing with insurance companies and ramp up pressure on them to not underwrite things like the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or we've seen a lot of success with up in Alaska, in Alaska Native villages who have utilized this strategy in protecting the Arctic wildlife refuge. So, yep, and pressure pension funds. You can do this at your college level. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you. I do want to be respectful of our time, and any questions that we didn't get to, folks are welcome to follow up with me, Dan K. Williams at citizen.org, and I can help answer anything that we did not get to. But I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to the organizers who made tonight possible, and a huge thank you to our speakers. You can expect a follow-up email with a recording of tonight's webinar and all of the links that we shared. That should come end of this week, maybe early next week. But I hope everyone has a great rest of their night, and thank you again for joining.